Des Moines, Iowa, October 15th, 1993, 11:47 p.m. Temperature 34. The autumn storm hammered against the windows of 2047 Maple Grove Avenue with a relentless fury that seemed to echo the chaos brewing inside Darlene Kowalski's mind. Lightning illuminated her pale face in stark, ghostly flashes as she sat motionless at her kitchen table, staring at the local newspaper spread before her. The headline screamed in bold black letters, "Third victim found, Deer Creek killer strikes again." The coffee in her trembling hands had long since gone cold, but Darlene barely noticed. Her eyes, red-rimmed from hours of sleepless torment, traced the same paragraph over and over again, each word cutting deeper into her soul, like shards of broken glass. The body of 19-year-old Timothy Brennan was discovered early this morning in the wooded area near Deer Creek Park, bearing the same brutal signature wounds as the previous victims. Police report that, like the others, Brennan had been stabbed 17 times in a precise pattern that investigators believe holds significance to the killer. 17 times. Always 17 times. Darlene's breath caught in her throat as the memory crashed over her like a tidal wave. 3 weeks ago, her son Dominic had come home with scratches on his arms, deep, angry red lines that he'd dismissed as just fooling around in the woods behind Miller's farm. When she'd pressed him about it, his usually warm brown eyes had turned cold, distant, almost predatory. "Don't worry about it, Ma," he'd said, that strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes you gotta break a few things to build something better." At the time, she'd chalked it up to typical 19-year-old bravado. Dominic had always been different from other kids, quieter, more intense, with an unsettling ability to read people's weaknesses and exploit them. But he was her son, her baby boy who used to curl up next to her during thunderstorms, just like this one, seeking comfort in her embrace. Now, as thunder crashed overhead and rain lashed against the windows, Darlene found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the young man sleeping upstairs. The first victim had been found 6 weeks ago. Rebecca Martinez, a sweet 20-year-old who worked at the local diner where Dominic often went for coffee. Darlene remembered how he'd mentioned Rebecca's death almost casually over dinner, his tone unnaturally flat as he described how some sick freak had killed her. But there had been something in his eyes, a flicker of what almost looked like satisfaction, that had made her stomach turn. The second victim, found 3 weeks later, was Jonathan Walsh, a college student from Drake University. Darlene had never heard Dominic mention Jonathan before, but when the news broke, her son had seemed oddly well informed about the young man's habits, his schedule, even his fear of walking alone at night. "How do you know so much about him?" she'd asked during one of their increasingly tense dinner conversations. Dominic had shrugged, cutting his meat with mechanical precision. "People talk, Ma. You hear things around town. But Des Moines wasn't that small of a town, and the things Dominic heard were far too specific, too intimate for casual gossip." Now Timothy Brennan was dead, and Darlene could no longer ignore the growing mountain of evidence that was slowly crushing her beneath its weight. She rose from the table on unsteady legs and moved to the kitchen window, peering through the rain-streaked glass toward the detached garage, where Dominic spent most of his time. He called it his workshop, though she'd never seen him actually work on anything out there. The building sat dark and silent now, its windows black as dead eyes staring back at her. 3 months ago, he'd installed a heavy-duty lock on the garage door, claiming he was storing valuable tools inside. When she'd jokingly asked to see his projects, his response had been swift and sharp. "Some things are private, Ma. A man needs his space." The way he'd said "man" with such cold emphasis had sent chills down her spine. This wasn't the son who used to help her bake cookies for the church fundraiser. This wasn't the boy who'd cried when their family dog Rusty had died of cancer 2 years ago. Or had he cried? The more Darlene thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't actually remember seeing tears. She remembered him saying the right words, making the appropriate sounds of grief, But had there been actual emotion behind it? Lightning split the sky again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Darlene thought she saw a figure moving near the garage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her face closer to the window, straining to see through the storm. But when the next flash came, the yard appeared empty. "You are losing your mind," she told herself. "You are seeing things that aren't there because you want to believe your son isn't a monster." But deep down, in the place where maternal instinct lived alongside terrible truth, she knew better. Darlene moved through the house like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. She paused at the bottom of the staircase, listening for any sound from Dominic's room. The old Victorian house creaked and groaned around her, but she heard nothing from upstairs. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Is he even up there? The thought hit her like a physical blow. She'd assumed he was sleeping, but what if he wasn't? What if he was out there right now, hunting for his next victim while she sat in her kitchen drowning in suspicion and self-doubt? She climbed the stairs slowly, each step an eternity of dread. The hallways stretched before her, dark and seemingly endless. Dominic's door was closed, as it always was these days. She pressed her ear against the wood, holding her breath as she listened. Silence. Her trembling hand found the doorknob, and she turned it with agonizing care. The door opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of moonlit room beyond. Dominic's bed was empty, the covers thrown back as if he'd left in a hurry. Panic flooded her system like ice water. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the familiar space that suddenly felt alien and threatening. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings. She'd noticed them before but never paid close attention. Now, in the pale light filtering through the rain-soaked windows, she could see what they actually were. Crime stories. Dozens of them. Articles about unsolved murders, missing persons cases, serial killers from across the country. The clippings were organized with obsessive precision, pinned to the wall in neat rows like trophies in a hunter's den. Darlene's legs nearly gave out as she spotted a familiar headline: "Local woman found murdered in Deer Creek Park." Rebecca Martinez's smiling face looked back at her from a photograph that had been circled in red ink. Next to it, another clipping about Jonathan Walsh, also circled, also marked with that same crimson color that now looked disturbingly like dried blood. But it was the third article that made her stomach lurch and her vision blur at the edges. Timothy Brennan's story was already pinned to the wall, the ink still fresh on the newspaper, which meant Dominic had known about the murder before it was even discovered, before it had been reported, before anyone except the killer could have known. A sound from downstairs made her freeze, the soft click of the back door opening and closing. He was home. Darlene's mind raced as she heard Dominic's footsteps moving through the kitchen below. She couldn't let him know she'd been in his room, couldn't let him suspect that she was beginning to piece together the horrifying truth. With movements born of pure terror, she backed out of his room and closed the door as quietly as possible. She made it to her own bedroom just as she heard his feet on the stairs. Through her slightly open door, she watched him pause in the hallway, his head tilted as if he were listening, sensing something out of place. In the dim light, his profile looked sharp and predatory, like a wolf testing the air for the scent of prey. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, he continued to his room. Darlene held her breath until she heard his door close, then collapsed onto her bed, her whole body shaking with the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Her son, her own flesh and blood, was the Deer Creek killer. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her gasping and nauseous. How many nights had she slept peacefully in this house, while a monster lived just down the hall? How many times had she kissed his forehead and told him she loved him, never knowing that those same hands had taken innocent lives? She thought about Timothy Brennan's parents, probably lying awake at this very moment, tormented by grief and the desperate need for answers. She thought about Rebecca Martinez's mother, who came into the grocery store where Darlene worked, and always looked like she was barely holding herself together. She thought about Jonathan Walsh's girlfriend, who'd been interviewed on the local news, begging for information about who could have done such a terrible thing. And all this time, the killer had been sitting at her dinner table, asking her to pass the salt and complimenting her pot roast. What kind of mother doesn't know her own child is a murderer? The question tore through her like a blade, bringing with it a shame so profound it threatened to suffocate her. She was supposed to know Dominic better than anyone. She was supposed to be able to read his moods, understand his thoughts, sense when something was wrong. Instead, she'd been blind to the darkness growing inside him, oblivious to the evil that had been festering under her own roof. But now she knew. The question was, what was she going to do about it? She could call the police right now. Detective Reynolds, who'd been handling the case, had given his card to every family in the neighborhood, urging anyone with information to come forward. She could dial those numbers and tell them to come arrest her son, to take him away and end this nightmare once and for all. But then what? The media would descend on their quiet street like vultures. The neighbors who'd known her for 15 years would look at her with suspicion and disgust. Her co-workers would whisper behind her back, wondering how she could have lived with a killer and not known. More importantly, she'd be destroying any chance of understanding why this had happened. If she turned Dominic in now, she'd never get answers to the questions that were already eating her alive. What had turned her seemingly normal son into a monster? When had it started? Were there signs she'd missed, warning signals she'd ignored? And perhaps most terrifyingly of all, were there more victims she didn't know about? The storm outside was beginning to weaken, but the tempest in Darlene's mind was just getting started. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling as rain continued to patter against her windows, and tried to come up with a plan. She needed proof, real evidence, not just newspaper clippings and suspicious timing. If she was going to destroy her son's life, and her own in the process, she needed to be absolutely certain. She owed that much to the victims, to their families, and to the terrified community that was living in fear of the next attack. Tomorrow she would find a way to get into that garage. She would search for the evidence she knew must be there. The weapon, perhaps, or souvenirs from his crimes. Serial killers always kept souvenirs, didn't they? She'd read enough true crime books to know that much. The irony wasn't lost on her that her hobby of reading about murderers and their methods might now help her catch one. She'd always been fascinated by the psychology of killers, the way their minds worked, the patterns they followed. She'd devoured books by profilers and investigators, trying to understand how people could do such terrible things to their fellow human beings. Never in her darkest nightmares had she imagined she'd be using that knowledge to investigate her own son. As the first pale hints of dawn began to creep through her curtains, Darlene finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, filled with nightmares of red ink and 17 wounds, and the sound of her son's footsteps in the hall. In her dreams, she was running through endless corridors, trying to reach doors that kept moving further away, while behind her, a voice that sounded exactly like Dominic's whispered, "Sometimes you gotta break a few things to build something better." She woke several hours later to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs, and the sound of her son humming in the kitchen. For just a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, everything felt normal. Then reality crashed back down on her like a collapsing building, and she remembered her son was a killer, and somehow she had to find the strength to face him across the breakfast table and pretend that nothing had changed. Darlene rose from her bed on shaking legs and began the longest day of her life. Des Moines, Iowa, October 16, 1993, 7:23 a.m. Temperature 41°F. Overcast skies, light drizzle. The kitchen felt like a stage set for a play she'd never auditioned for. Darlene stood at the counter, mechanically buttering toast while her son sat at the table behind her. The newspaper spread before him like a shrine to his own handiwork. The sound of pages turning made her skin crawl. each rustle a reminder that he was probably reading about Timothy Brennan's murder with the satisfaction of an artist admiring his latest masterpiece. "Morning, Ma." Dominic's voice carried its usual casual warmth, but now it sounded like a wolf learning to imitate human speech. "Sleep well?" The irony of the question nearly made her laugh, a sharp, hysterical sound that she barely managed to swallow. She'd gotten maybe 2 hours of broken sleep, punctuated by nightmares and the constant awareness that a killer was sleeping 20 feet away from her. "Fine, honey," she managed, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Years of Midwestern politeness, of keeping family business private, of maintaining appearances no matter what chaos lurked beneath the surface. It was all serving her now in the most twisted way imaginable. She turned to face him, and for a moment the familiar sight of her son nearly undid her careful composure. Dominic looked exactly as he always did, sandy brown hair slightly mussed from sleep, wearing the old flannel shirt she'd bought him for Christmas 2 years ago. He was handsome in an unremarkable way, with the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. She'd always thought that was unfortunate, but now she realized it was probably an asset in his chosen profession. "Terrible business about that boy," she said, nodding toward the newspaper as she set his breakfast in front of him. Her hands were remarkably steady, though inside she felt like she was disintegrating molecule by molecule. Dominic looked up at her with those brown eyes she'd gazed into countless times when he was a baby, searching for any sign of fever or illness or simple childhood unhappiness. Now she found herself searching for something entirely different, some glimpse of the monster that had to be lurking behind that familiar face. "Yeah, real shame," he said, cutting into his eggs with precise movements. 3 kids dead now. Makes you wonder what kind of sick bastard would do something like that. The casual vulgarity was new. Dominic had always been careful about his language around her, but more disturbing was the way he said it, with just a hint of professional admiration, like a chef complimenting a competitor's knife work. "The police don't seem to have any leads," she ventured, taking her own seat across from him and trying to ignore the way her coffee cup rattled against the saucer when she set it down. "Oh, I don't know about that." Dominic's smile was small and private. "I think they know more than they are letting on. They always do in cases like this. Cases like this." As if he were an expert, as if he'd studied them extensively. Which, she realized with growing horror, he probably had. "How would you know?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, sharper than she'd intended. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or calculation. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was just her son again, looking mildly puzzled by her tone. "Just seems logical, doesn't it? I mean, they must have some evidence, or they wouldn't be so confident about catching this guy." He took another bite of eggs, chewing thoughtfully. "Though between you and me, I think they are probably looking in all the wrong places." The certainty in his voice made her blood turn to ice water. He wasn't speculating. He was speaking from knowledge. The knowledge of someone who knew exactly where the police should be looking, because he knew exactly where they shouldn't. "Where do you think they should be looking?" she asked, proud of herself for keeping her voice level and curious rather than accusatory. Dominic shrugged, his attention seemingly focused on his breakfast. "Closer to home, probably. These types of killers, they usually operate in areas they know well, familiar territory." He looked up at her then, and for just a second she thought she saw something predatory in his gaze. "Could be anyone, really. Your neighbor, your co-worker, your..." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. "Your family." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that she didn't want to acknowledge. Was he testing her, seeing how much she suspected, or was this just more of his casual cruelty, the way he'd always enjoyed making people uncomfortable without quite crossing the line into open hostility? "That's a terrible thought," she said finally. "Yeah," he agreed, but there was no real emotion behind the word. "Terrible." They finished breakfast in relative silence, The only sounds the scrape of cutlery against plates and the distant hum of traffic on Maple Grove Avenue. Darlene found herself studying his hands as he ate, long-fingered and surprisingly graceful, with calluses she'd never really noticed before. Calluses that could have come from working with tools or weapons. "I will be in the garage most of the day," Dominic announced as he stood to clear his plate. "Working on a project." "What kind of project?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Just something I have been tinkering with. Nothing too exciting." That private smile again, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "I should be done with it soon, though. Then I can move on to something new." The casual way he said it, something new, made her think of hunting seasons, of predators moving through cycles of stalking and killing before moving on to fresh territory. After he left for the garage, Darlene sat alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the newspaper he'd left behind. The headline about Timothy Brennan's murder was facing up, and she noticed that certain words had been circled lightly in pencil, so lightly that she hadn't seen the marks earlier. The word 17 was circled. So were pattern and signature and precision. It was like he was grading his own work. Around 10 o'clock, she heard the sound of his car starting up in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she watched him pull away, probably heading to his job at Morrison's hardware store. He worked part-time there, mostly handling inventory in the back room where he rarely had to interact with customers. She'd always thought he was just shy, but now she wondered if there were other reasons he preferred to remain invisible. This was her chance. Darlene had never been the kind of person who snooped through other people's belongings. Even when Dominic was a teenager, she'd respected his privacy, trusting him to make good choices and come to her if he needed help. That trust seemed impossibly naive now, but it had also meant that she'd never developed any skills for covert investigation. She felt clumsy and obvious as she made her way across the backyard toward the garage, constantly looking over her shoulder as if the neighbors might somehow sense what she was planning. The building squatted at the back of their property like a malignant growth, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She'd helped Dominic's father build this garage 15 years ago, back when their biggest worry was whether they could afford the mortgage payments. Now it felt like approaching a tomb. The heavy-duty padlock Dominic had installed looked formidable, but Darlene had an advantage he probably hadn't considered. She still had the original key to the building from before he'd changed the locks. The question was whether he'd also changed the mechanism entirely, or just added the external security. Her hands shook as she tried the old key in the original lock, hidden behind the newer hardware. For a moment, nothing happened, and she felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Then the tumblers clicked and the door swung open with a rusty groan that seemed to echo across the entire neighborhood. The smell hit her first, a mixture of chemicals, rust, and something else that made her stomach lurch. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. She fumbled for the light switch, dreading what she might see but knowing she had to look. The single bare bulb illuminated a space that bore no resemblance to the garage she remembered. Gone were the lawn mower, the garden tools, the Christmas decorations stored in clearly labeled boxes. Instead, the space had been transformed into something that looked like a combination workshop and laboratory. A workbench dominated one wall, covered with tools she didn't recognize. Knives of various sizes, some with curved blades, others straight and narrow. There were other implements too, pliers, small saws, what looked like medical instruments. All of them were meticulously clean and organized, arranged with the kind of obsessive precision that spoke of frequent use. But it was the photographs that made her knees buckle. They covered an entire wall, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in black and white. Some appeared to be taken from a distance, showing people going about their daily lives, unaware they were being watched. Others were closer, more intimate, capturing expressions of fear or pain or confusion. And at the center of this grotesque gallery were three larger photographs that she recognized with a shock of horror that nearly made her vomit. Rebecca Martinez, Jonathan Walsh, and Timothy Brennan. But these weren't the smiling school photos that had appeared in the newspaper. These showed them in their final moments, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in screams that no one had been close enough to hear. Darlene sank into a folding chair that sat in front of this wall of horrors, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't just evidence of her son's crimes, it was a shrine to them. He came out here to look at these images, to relive what he'd done, to plan what he'd do next. A wooden filing cabinet sat next to the workbench, and with trembling hands, she opened the top drawer. Inside were manila folders, each one labeled with a name and a date. Some of the names she recognized from the newspapers, missing persons cases from across Iowa and neighboring states, going back almost 3 years. Others were unfamiliar, which was somehow even more terrifying. How many people had died at her son's hands? How many families were still waiting for answers that would never come? The bottom drawer contained what looked like a journal, bound in black leather and filled with Dominic's careful handwriting. She opened it at random and immediately wished she hadn't. Subject exhibited interesting psychological deterioration before termination. Note for future reference: isolation increases desperation, makes them more willing to beg. RM lasted 47 minutes before succumbing to blood loss. Considerably longer than JW, 23 minutes, but not as long as anticipated. May need to adjust technique for optimal results. The clinical language was almost worse than outright sadism would have been. He was treating murder like a science experiment, carefully documenting his methods and results for future improvement. She flipped through more pages, each one revealing new depths of her son's depravity, but it was the final entry that made her blood freeze in her veins. Next subject identified: E.H., age 17, works after school at Brennan's Bakery on 5th Street. Walks home alone through Riverside Park every Tuesday and Thursday. Confirmed she carries pepper spray, but minimal other defensive measures. Preliminary surveillance complete. Acquisition scheduled for Thursday, October 21st. This one will be special, first to experience the new improved methodology, Thursday. That was 5 days away. Darlene slammed the journal shut and ran for the door, gasping for fresh air, as her stomach rebelled against the horrors she'd just witnessed. She barely made it to the side of the garage before she was violently sick, her breakfast coming up in acidic waves that burned her throat and left her weak and shaking. Like some 17-year-old girl, whose only crime was working at a bakery and walking home through the park. A girl who had no idea that she was being watched, studied, prepared for slaughter by a monster, who saw her as nothing more than raw material for his twisted experiments. She had to do something. She had to stop this. But as she stood there in the pale October sunlight, wiping vomit from her mouth with the back of her hand, Darlene realized that calling the police might not be enough. Even if they believed her, even if they moved quickly. Dominic was smart and careful. He might sense the trap might disappear before they could catch him, and then some other girl in some other town would become his next victim. No. She needed a different plan. Something that would guarantee his capture, that would end this nightmare once and for all. As she walked back toward the house on unsteady legs, an idea began to form in her mind. It was dangerous, probably foolish, and it would require her to do things that went against every maternal instinct she'd ever had. But if it saved BH's life, if it stopped her son from killing again, then she would find the strength to do what needed to be done. Even if it destroyed her in the process. The sound of a car in the driveway made her freeze halfway across the yard. Dominic was home early, his rust-colored Ford Escort pulling up to the garage with a soft crunch of gravel. She was still too far from the house to make it inside without being seen, too close to the garage to pretend she'd just been gardening or hanging laundry. Their eyes met through his windshield, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Mother and son stared at each other across a distance that might as well have been a chasm. In his face, she saw knowledge. He knew that she knew. The careful game they'd been playing was over. When Dominic stepped out of the car, he was smiling. But it wasn't the fake warmth he'd been showing her for months. This was something else entirely. The expression of a predator who'd just realized that the hunt had taken an interesting new turn. "Hey Ma," he said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Find anything interesting?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Darlene felt every muscle in her body coiling with the primitive urge to run, but her feet remained rooted to the damp earth of their backyard. 20 yards of autumn grass separated her from her son, but the distance felt both infinite and nowhere near enough. She began, then stopped. What was the point of lying now? The knowledge sat between them like a loaded gun, and they both knew it. Dominic tilted his head, studying her with the clinical interest she'd seen him direct at wounded animals when he was younger. Back then, she'd thought it was natural curiosity. Now she understood it had been something else entirely. The fascination of a predator learning to understand pain. "You were just looking through my things," he finished for her, taking a step closer. His movements were casual, unhurried, but there was something calculated about his posture that made every nerve in her body scream danger. "Finding out what your son does in his spare time." "Dominic," his name came out as barely a whisper. "It's funny, you know," he continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "I always wondered when you'd figure it out. You are not stupid, Ma. Naive, maybe. Trusting, but not stupid." He moved closer, and she could see his eyes more clearly now. They were still the same brown eyes she'd looked into countless times over the years, but there was something behind them that transformed his entire face. Something cold and calculating and utterly without empathy. "How long have you known?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Known what?" "That you suspected me?" He shrugged, hands sliding into the pockets of his jacket. "A couple weeks, maybe. You started watching me differently, asking different questions. Plus you have been having nightmares. I could hear you tossing and turning, calling out in your sleep." The idea that he'd been monitoring her sleep, cataloging her distress like another one of his experiments, made her skin crawl. How many nights had he stood outside her bedroom door, listening to her unconscious mind wrestling with the truth? "I meant," she swallowed hard, fighting for courage. "How long have you been doing this?" For the first time since he'd gotten out of the car, Dominic's expression shifted. The mask of casual friendliness slipped away entirely, replaced by something that was purely predatory. When he smiled, it was with genuine pleasure, the way other people might smile when discussing a hobby they were passionate about. "Oh man, much longer than you'd want to know." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She'd been hoping on some level that this was recent, that something had happened to change him. Some trauma or mental break that could explain the monster he'd become. But the casual way he said it, the obvious satisfaction in her shock, told her a different story. "The animals," she said suddenly, pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "When you were 12, all those cats that went missing in the neighborhood." "Very good," he applauded slowly, mockingly. "I was wondering if you'd ever connect those dots. Poor Mr. Henderson's tabby was my first real success. Before that, it was just mice and birds, but they don't really respond the way larger subjects do." Subjects. He was talking about living creatures, about pets that families had loved and mourned, as if they were laboratory specimens. "You were just a child," she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't an excuse. It was an accusation. How had she missed the signs? How had she failed so completely as a mother that her 12-year-old son had been torturing animals and she'd never noticed? "I was learning," he corrected, "practicing, getting better at understanding how things work, how they break, how long it takes." His eyes grew distant, almost nostalgic. "Rebecca was my first human subject. I'd been watching her for months, studying her patterns, her reactions. She was perfect, young, trusting, predictable." The casual way he spoke about Rebecca Martinez, as if she'd been nothing more than a convenient test subject, ignited something fierce and protective in Darlene's chest. Rebecca had been someone's daughter, someone's hope for the future. She'd had dreams and fears, and people who loved her, and her life had been snuffed out by a monster who saw her as nothing more than raw material for his twisted education. She was 19 years old, Darlene said, her voice growing stronger. She had a family, friends, a life. She had a function, Dominic replied with a slight shrug, and she fulfilled it admirably. Really, Ma, you should be proud. All those times you told me to apply myself, to find something I was good at and pursue it with dedication, well, I finally did. The perverse logic of it, the way he was twisting her own maternal encouragement in justification for murder, made her feel sick all over again. But beneath the nausea was something else, a growing anger that burned hotter than her fear. What about Timothy Brennan? She demanded. What about Jonathan Walsh? What function did they serve? Progress, he said simply. Each one taught me something new. Jonathan showed me that young men require different techniques than young women. They are stronger, more likely to fight back, but also more predictable in their responses to pain. Timothy, his smile grew wider. Timothy was where I really started to perfect the methodology. You are sick, she breathed. I'm evolved, he corrected. Most people go through their entire lives never understanding what they are truly capable of. They are constrained by artificial moral constructs, by social conditioning that tells them certain things are wrong without any logical basis. I broke free of all that. You broke free of being human. Exactly. The word carried no shame, no regret, only a kind of pride that made her stomach turn. Humanity is just another cage, Ma. Another set of limitations designed to keep people from exploring their true potential. Darlene looked at her son, this stranger wearing her child's face, and realized that everything she thought she knew about him had been carefully constructed lies. The quiet boy who'd helped her with grocery shopping, who'd never caused trouble in school, who'd seemed so unremarkable that teachers barely remembered him. All of it had been a performance designed to keep her from seeing the truth. The girl, she said suddenly, E.H., the one you were planning to. His eyes sharpened with interest. You really did read everything, didn't you? Yes, Elena. Elena Hartwell. 17, works part-time at Brennan's Bakery, walks home alone through Riverside Park twice a week. He spoke about her the way a hunter might discuss tracking patterns. She's going to be special, Ma. All the things I learned from the others, all the improvements to the process. She will benefit from all of that knowledge. You are not going to touch her. The words came out with more force than Darlene had intended, fueled by a maternal rage that had nothing to do with protecting her own child and everything to do with protecting someone else's. Elena Hartwell was some stranger's daughter, walking home from work with no idea that death was watching her from the shadows. Dominic's eyebrows rose in apparent amusement. Oh, and how exactly do you plan to stop me? It was a fair question, and one she didn't have a good answer to. She was a 52-year-old grocery store clerk going up against a methodical killer who'd been practicing his craft for years. In terms of physical capability, psychological cunning, and sheer ruthlessness, she was hopelessly outmatched. But she was also his mother, and despite everything he'd become, despite the monster he'd revealed himself to be, she knew him in ways that no one else did. She'd raised him, lived with him, observed his habits and patterns for 19 years. If anyone could find a weakness in his defenses, it would be her. I could call the police right now, she said. You could, he agreed. But you won't. What makes you so sure? Because you are my mother. The words carried a weight of certainty that chilled her. Because despite what you have learned, despite what you know I have done, there's still a part of you that loves me, that wants to protect me, that hopes somehow this can all be fixed. The terrible thing was that he was right. Even now, even after seeing the photographs and reading his clinical descriptions of torture and murder, some deep part of her was still searching for a way to save him. It was irrational, impossible, potentially deadly, but it was also unshakably real. Besides, he continued, even if you did call them, what would you tell them? That you illegally broke into my garage and found some photographs and a journal. Everything you saw was obtained without a warrant, which means most of it would be inadmissible in court. At best, they'd bring me in for questioning, and I'd just deny everything. Without concrete physical evidence linking me to the crime scenes, they'd have to let me go. His knowledge of legal procedures was unsettling, but not surprising. He'd clearly thought this through, planned for the possibility of discovery and arrest. He wasn't just a killer, he was a careful, methodical killer who'd taken steps to protect himself. And then, he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, I'd know that you betrayed me, that you chose strangers over your own son. How do you think that would affect our relationship? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If she went to the police and failed to get him arrested, she'd become another problem that needed to be solved. Another subject for his twisted experiments. What do you want from me? She asked. Nothing complicated. Just continue being my mother. Keep making my breakfast, doing my laundry, maintaining the facade of our normal little family. In exchange, I will be more careful about covering my tracks. You won't have to see the photographs anymore, won't have to read the journals. You can go back to pretending I'm just your quiet, unremarkable son. And Elena Hartwell will serve her function, just as the others did. His voice hardened slightly. That's not negotiable, Ma. The work has to continue, but I can make sure you are not directly exposed to the details. It was a devil's bargain, and they both knew it. Stay silent, enable his crimes, and she could maintain the illusion of normalcy while innocent people died. Or resist, and likely become a victim herself while failing to save anyone. But there was a third option, one that had been growing in her mind ever since she'd read about Elena in his journal. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be the only way to save the girl's life and stop Dominic from killing again. I need time to think, she said. Of course. He was magnanimous in victory, already confident that he'd won. Take all the time you need. But remember, Elena's appointment is Thursday evening. That gives you 5 days to come to terms with reality. 5 days. She had 5 days to figure out how to stop a killer who knew her better than anyone else in the world, who had every advantage except one. He didn't know that she'd rather die than let him hurt another innocent person. As they walked back toward the house together, maintaining the grotesque parody of familial normalcy, Darlene's mind was already racing ahead to Thursday evening. To Riverside Park and Elena Hartwell's walk home from work. To the confrontation that would either save a girl's life or end her own. The next few hours passed in a surreal haze of domestic routine. Dominic helped her bring in the groceries she'd bought earlier, complimented her choice of pot roast for dinner, even offered to fix the squeaky hinge on the pantry door. To any outside observer, they would have looked like a perfectly normal mother and son going about their Saturday afternoon. But underneath the facade, both of them were planning. Dominic disappeared back to his garage after lunch, presumably to continue whatever preparations he was making for Thursday. Darlene watched him from the kitchen window, noting the casual way he moved, the complete absence of guilt or anxiety in his posture. He was looking forward to what he had planned for Elena Hartwell. She spent the afternoon in her own form of preparation. She called Elena's workplace, Brennan's Bakery, and confirmed that the girl did indeed work Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, walking home around 6 o'clock when her shift ended. She drove the route from the bakery to Riverside Park, timing how long it took and noting potential hiding places where a predator might wait for his victim. Most importantly, she began to formulate a plan. It wasn't a good plan. It relied too heavily on luck and timing, and it required her to do things that went against every instinct she'd developed over 5 decades of being a law-abiding citizen. But it was the only plan that might work, the only way she could think of to turn Dominic's own methods against him. Sunday passed in the same tense normalcy as Saturday, with both of them maintaining their roles in the family drama, while underneath, the countdown to Thursday continued. Darlene found herself studying her son with new eyes, cataloging his habits and reactions the way he'd cataloged his victims. When did he sleep most deeply? What sounds in the house would wake him? How long did it take him to become fully alert when roused? Monday brought a new development. A knock at the door that made both of them freeze in the middle of breakfast. Detective Frank Reynolds stood on their front porch, his badge visible in the morning light. He was a thin man in his 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much of humanity's capacity for evil. "Mrs. Kowalski? I'm Detective Reynolds with the Des Moines Police Department. I wondered if I could ask you and your son a few questions about the recent murders." Darlene's heart hammered against her ribs as she invited him in, hyper-aware of Dominic standing just behind her in the hallway. This was it, the moment of truth. Would she maintain the facade and protect her son, or would she find some way to signal that the killer was standing 3 feet away from the detective? "Of course, Detective," she heard herself saying. "We will do anything we can to help." As they settled in the living room, she caught Dominic's eye and saw something that chilled her to the bone. He was excited, the proximity to danger, the thrill of sitting across from the man hunting him while maintaining perfect innocence. It was just another game to him, another opportunity to test his skills. "This is just routine," Detective Reynolds assured them, pulling out a small notebook. "We are canvassing the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have seen something unusual in the past few months." "Terrible business," Dominic said, his voice carrying exactly the right note of concerned citizen. "Makes you afraid to let your family walk alone after dark." "Indeed. Have either of you noticed anyone suspicious in the area? People who don't belong? Vehicles you haven't seen before? Anything like that?" Darlene opened her mouth, the truth burning on her tongue like acid. "The killer is sitting right next to you." She wanted to scream. "He's been planning his next murder while I make his breakfast." But instead she heard herself saying, "Nothing out of the ordinary, Detective. It's usually such a quiet neighborhood." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Detective Reynolds asking about their schedules, their knowledge of the victims, their theories about what kind of person might be responsible for such crimes. Through it all, Dominic played his part perfectly. Helpful, concerned, just knowledgeable enough to seem like an engaged citizen, but not so much as to raise suspicion. It was a masterful performance, and watching it made Darlene realize just how dangerous her son truly was. This wasn't some sloppy amateur who'd gotten lucky 3 times. This was a careful, intelligent predator who'd been planning for exactly this kind of scrutiny. After the detective left, Dominic turned to her with a smile that was genuinely pleased. "That went well, don't you think?" He seemed satisfied with our answers. "You enjoyed that," she said, not bothering to hide her disgust. "Of course I did. It's all part of the process, Ma. The challenge isn't just in the hunt itself, it's in maintaining the perfect facade afterward. Anyone can kill someone. It takes real skill to do it repeatedly without getting caught. He will figure it out eventually. Maybe, but not before Thursday." His smile widened. "And after Elena, I think it might be time to expand my territory. Maybe try my hand in a different city, see how my techniques translate to new hunting ground." The casual way he discussed leaving, abandoning her to deal with the aftermath while he moved on to terrorize some other community, crystallized her resolve. Whatever happened on Thursday, whatever the cost to herself, she was going to make sure that Dominic Kowalski never hurt another innocent person. Tuesday and Wednesday crawled by with agonizing slowness. Darlene went through the motions of normal life, working at the grocery store, preparing meals, watching television with her son in the evenings. But underneath the surface, she was making final preparations for what she'd started thinking of as her mission. She withdrew $500 from her savings account, telling the bank teller it was for home repairs. She bought a small tape recorder from the electronics store downtown, along with several blank cassettes. Most importantly, she drove to a hardware store in the next town over and purchased a few items that she prayed she'd have the courage to use when the time came. Wednesday evening, as she and Dominic sat watching a movie on television, she found herself memorizing his face, not the face of the monster she now knew him to be, but the face of the boy she'd raised, the child who'd once crawled into her bed during thunderstorms and asked her to check his closet for monsters. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent years protecting him from imaginary monsters, never realizing she was raising a real one. "Big day tomorrow," he said during a commercial break, his tone conversational. "Yes," she replied, "it is." If he heard the double meaning in her words, he didn't show it. He was too focused on his own plans, too confident in his control over the situation, to consider that his mother might have plans of her own. That night, Darlene lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere down the hall, Dominic was probably sleeping peacefully, dreaming of what he had planned for Elena Hartwell. The thought made her sick, but it also strengthened her resolve. Tomorrow, one way or another, it would all be over. She just prayed that when the sun set on Thursday, Elena Hartwell would still be alive to see Friday morning. Des Moines, Iowa, October 21st, 1993, 3:47 p.m. Temperature 39°50 F. Clear skies turning overcast. Wind picking up from the north. The day Elena Hartwell was supposed to die dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn afternoon that should have been filled with the simple pleasures of falling leaves and the promise of evening warmth. Instead, Darlene Kowalski spent the morning moving through her house like a woman preparing for her own execution, checking and rechecking the items she'd hidden throughout the rooms where she'd raised a monster. The small tape recorder sat tucked beneath a kitchen towel, its red record button easily accessible. The hunting knife she'd purchased from Miller's Sporting Goods lay wrapped in an old dish rag inside the bread box, close enough to reach quickly, hidden enough that Dominic wouldn't notice it during his usual predatory scan of the room. Most importantly, the small vial of her late husband's sleeping medication, saved from his final illness 2 years ago, rested in her apron pocket like a cold weight against her hip. 30 pills. According to the research she'd done at the library, 30 pills dissolved in coffee should be more than enough to put a grown man to sleep permanently. The question was whether she'd have the courage to use them when the moment came. Dominic had left for his shift at Morrison's Hardware at his usual time, but not before making his intentions crystal clear. "I will be home around 4:30, he'd said, buttoning his work jacket with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Elena gets off work at 6, starts her walk through Riverside Park around 6:15. Should be dark enough by then for privacy. The casual way he'd discussed the timing of a 17-year-old girl's murder, as if he were coordinating a dinner reservation, had nearly broken Darlene's carefully maintained composure, but she'd managed to nod and mumble something about having pot roast ready when he got back, playing her role in their twisted domestic theater one last time. Now, with the afternoon shadows growing longer and Dominic's return approaching, she found herself standing in the kitchen where she'd fed him thousands of meals, where she'd bandaged his childhood scrapes and helped him with homework, where she'd never once suspected she was nurturing a killer. The normalcy of the space seemed to mock her. The cheerful yellow curtains she'd sewn herself, the refrigerator covered with old grocery lists and appointment reminders, the coffee pot that would soon serve as the delivery system for what she hoped would be a lethal dose of barbiturates. At 4:25, she heard his car in the driveway. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she started the coffee, the familiar routine of measuring and pouring, providing a strange comfort in the midst of her terror. She'd done this thousands of times before. The only difference was that this time she was trying to kill her own son. "Smells good in here," Dominic said as he came through the back door, his voice carrying its usual false warmth. "Coffee ready?" "Just finished brewing," she replied, proud of how normal she sounded. "How was work?" "Fine. Quiet day. He hung his jacket on the back of his chair and sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd eaten breakfast every morning for the past 19 years. Morrison asked me to work late tomorrow, but I told him I had family obligations tonight. Family obligations. As if murdering a teenager was just another item on his to-do list. Darlene poured 2 cups of coffee, her back to him as she carefully opened the vial and emptied its contents into his mug. The pills dissolved quickly, leaving only a slightly chalky residue that she stirred away with a spoon. When she turned around to hand him the cup, he was reading the newspaper, absorbed in an article about the police department's ongoing investigation. Says here they are bringing in some kind of profiler from the FBI, he said, taking a sip of his coffee without looking up. Supposed to help them understand the killer's psychology. Think that will help them catch him? She asked, settling into her own chair across from him. Doubt it. These profiler types always overcomplicate things, make the killer out to be some kind of mastermind when the truth is usually much simpler. He took another drink, larger this time. Most killers are just people who figured out that society's rules don't actually mean anything. Is that what you are? Someone who figured out the rules don't matter? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and for a moment they stared at each other across the table. But if Dominic was surprised by her directness, he didn't show it. I'm someone who stopped pretending that other people matter more than I do, he said simply. The only difference between me and everyone else is that I act on that truth instead of hiding from it. What about me? Do I matter? You are my mother. That makes you useful. He drained the rest of his coffee and set the mug down with a soft clink. As long as you continue to be useful. The casual cruelty of it, reducing their entire relationship to a matter of utility, crystallized everything that had been growing in Darlene's heart over the past week. This wasn't her son anymore, if it ever had been. This was a thing wearing her son's face, speaking with her son's voice, but utterly devoid of anything human. More coffee? She asked. Sure. He pushed the mug toward her, already returning his attention to the newspaper. Says here the victims' families are organizing some kind of vigil this weekend. Touching, really. How people cling to these meaningless rituals when they are faced with something they can't understand. Darlene poured him another cup, this one clean, and watched as he drank it absently while reading. The first dose should be taking effect soon. The medication had always worked quickly on his father, bringing sleep within 30 minutes of ingestion. But she needed to keep Dominic talking, needed to extract something that could be used as evidence when this was all over. The tape recorder was still hidden beneath the kitchen towel, its red light invisible, but recording every word. Tell me about Rebecca, she said. He looked up from the newspaper, his eyes already slightly unfocused. What about her? I want to understand. Help me understand how it started. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, perhaps because of the drugs beginning to affect his judgment, or perhaps because he was simply proud of his work, he began to speak. Rebecca was perfect because she trusted me. I'd been going to the diner for months, building a rapport, letting her get comfortable with my presence. She started to smile when she saw me coming, to save my favorite booth, to remember how I liked my coffee. His voice carried a nostalgic quality that made Darlene's skin crawl. Trust is the most valuable tool a hunter can have. People want to believe that the person sitting across from them, talking to them, sharing coffee with them, is fundamentally like them. They can't conceive of something truly different. So you used her kindness against her. I used her weakness. The inability to recognize a predator even when it's sitting 3 feet away, chatting about the weather and leaving decent tips. He rubbed his temples, and she could see the medication starting to affect his motor control. She followed me into the parking lot because I told her I thought someone had hit my car. Concerned, helpful Rebecca wanting to make sure I was okay. And then I showed her what she really was, what they all really are, underneath the social conditioning and moral pretenses. Just animals, terrified and desperate when you strip away their illusions. His words were beginning to slur slightly. She begged. You know, they all beg. Eventually. Promise anything. Offer anything. If you will just let them live. Shows you how much all their principles really mean when survival is on the line. Darlene felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced herself to keep listening, to keep recording. This was evidence. This was proof that could convict him, could bring justice for Rebecca and Jonathan and Timothy and all the others whose names she didn't even know. Jonathan was different, Dominic continued, his head beginning to nod forward slightly. Stronger, more aggressive. He actually tried to fight back for a while, which was educational. Taught me about the importance of proper restraints, about the psychological value of hopelessness. You kept them alive while you tortured them. I kept them conscious while I explored the boundaries of human endurance. There's a difference. His voice was definitely slurring now, and his eyelids were growing heavy. Most people die without ever understanding what they are truly capable of experiencing. I gave them that gift. What about Timothy? Timothy? Dominic's head drooped further, and she could see him fighting the effects of the medication. Timothy was where I really started to perfect the process. The right combination of physical trauma and psychological pressure to achieve maximum. His words trailed off as his eyes finally closed. For a moment she thought the drugs had finally taken full effect. Then his head snapped up and she saw something in his expression that made her blood freeze. What did you do? His voice was thick but alert, and his eyes had a dangerous clarity that told her the medication hadn't been as effective as she'd hoped. I don't know what you mean, she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late for pretense. The coffee. He pushed back from the table, swaying slightly but still upright. You drugged the coffee. There was no point in denying it now. Yes. Dad's sleeping pills? When she nodded, he actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Christ, Ma. I always knew you were tougher than you pretended to be, but I didn't think you had this in you. I'm not going to let you hurt Elena. No, he said, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. I don't suppose you are. For a moment they stared at each other across the kitchen table, and Darlene saw something she'd never seen in her son's face before. Respect. It was twisted and wrong, coming from a place of darkness rather than love, but it was real. The question is, he continued, his words coming with obvious effort, what exactly did you think was going to happen next? Drug me unconscious and then what? Call the police? Tell them you poisoned your own son? She hadn't thought that far ahead, and they both knew it. The plan had been to stop him from killing Elena, but she'd been so focused on that immediate goal that she hadn't considered what came after. I have evidence, she said. Recordings of what you just told me about Rebecca and Jonathan and Timothy. Inadmissible. Recorded without consent. He was fighting the drugs, but she could see it was a losing battle. His grip on the table was the only thing keeping him upright. Besides, even if they believed you, even if they arrested me, do you really think prison would hold me? Do you think bars and walls could contain what I have become? The question hung in the air between them, and Darlene realized that he was right. Even if she managed to get him arrested, even if he was convicted and sent away, it would only be temporary. He was too smart, too careful, too utterly without conscience to be contained by normal human institutions. Sooner or later he would find a way out, and when he did, there would be more victims. Starting with her. There's only one way this ends, Ma, he said, as if reading her thoughts. One way to make sure Elena and all the others after her stay safe. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to finish what you started. The words came out in a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. Because if you don't, if I wake up from this, then Elena dies tonight. And after Elena, there will be someone else. And someone else after that. He was right, and she knew it. The half dose of sleeping medication would wear off in a few hours, and when it did, her son would be free to continue his killing spree. Worse, he'd know that she'd tried to stop him, which meant she'd moved from useful family member to active threat. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can." His voice was growing fainter, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. "You have already shown you are willing to poison me to save a stranger's life. This is just following through." The knife in the bread box seemed to call to her, its weight pulling at her consciousness like gravity. She could feel its presence across the room, waiting for her to make the choice that would save Elena Hartwell's life and ensure that Dominic never hurt anyone else again. But he was still her son, still the baby she'd carried for 9 months, the toddler who'd taken his first steps in this very kitchen, the child who'd once needed her for everything from food to comfort to simple survival. "I used to think you were weak," Dominic said, his head finally beginning to sink toward the table. Soft, too concerned with other people's feelings to ever do what needed to be done. "But I was wrong, wasn't I? You are stronger than I am, strong enough to do the right thing even when it destroys you." The right thing, killing me. The words came out as barely a breath. "Before I hurt anyone else, before I become something even worse than I already am." His eyes closed, and this time they stayed closed. But his chest continued to rise and fall with the steady rhythm of drugged sleep, and she knew she had maybe an hour before the medication wore off completely. An hour to decide whether she was going to be the mother who saved her son from himself, or the mother who saved the world from her son. Darlene rose from her chair on unsteady legs and moved toward the bread box with the mechanical precision of someone following a script written in nightmare. The knife felt heavier than it should have, its blade catching the late afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. It was a good knife, sharp and well-balanced. Her husband had always insisted on quality tools. She stood over her sleeping son, the weapon trembling in her hand, and tried to find the courage to do what needed to be done. It would be easy. He was unconscious, defenseless, vulnerable. One quick cut across his throat, and Elena Hartwell would be safe. Everyone would be safe. But as she raised the knife, her hand began to shake violently. This was Dominic, her baby boy, the child she'd loved unconditionally for 19 years, even when he'd been difficult, even when he'd been strange, even when some deep part of her had known that something was wrong. Could she really murder her own son, even to save innocent lives? The question was answered by the sound of a car door slamming outside. Darlene rushed to the kitchen window and felt her heart stop. A rust-colored Ford Escort sat in the driveway, Dominic's car. But Dominic was unconscious at the kitchen table, which meant the back door opened, and Elena Hartwell stepped into the kitchen. She was small and dark-haired, with the kind of wholesome prettiness that belonged in high school yearbooks and family Christmas cards. She wore the white uniform of Brennan's Bakery, and her face carried the exhausted but satisfied expression of someone finishing a long shift. "Mr. Kowalski?" she called out, apparently not seeing Darlene standing frozen by the window. "You left your keys at the store, and Mrs. Morrison asked me to drop them off on my way home." Elena's eyes found Dominic slumped at the table, then traveled to Darlene standing with a knife in her hand, and her expression shifted from helpful concern to absolute terror. "Please," she whispered, backing toward the door. "I don't want any trouble. I will just leave the keys and go." "No," Darlene said, though whether she was talking to Elena or to herself, she wasn't sure. "You don't understand." But Elena was already running, bursting through the back door and racing toward her car with the desperate speed of prey that has suddenly realized it's walked into a trap. Darlene heard the engine start, heard gravel spray as Elena's car tore out of the driveway, and knew that in 5 minutes, maybe less, the police would be heading toward 20. Behind her, Dominic stirred, and his voice was thick and confused, but he was waking up faster than the drugs should have allowed. "What's happening?" "I heard a car." She turned to face him, the knife still in her hand, and saw his eyes widen as he took in the scene. His gaze moved from her face to the weapon, to the open back door, and she watched understanding dawn in his expression. "Elena was here," he said, It wasn't a question. She brought your keys. You left them at work. And she saw. He gestured vaguely at the tableau they must have presented. Darlene standing over his unconscious form, with a knife, looking every inch the deranged mother about to murder her own child. She saw what she saw. Dominic laughed, a sound that held genuine amusement despite his drugged state. So now the police will come, and they will find you holding a knife over your unconscious son's body, and Elena Hartwell will tell them she barely escaped being murdered by the crazy lady on Maple Grove Avenue. The full implications of what had just happened crashed over Darlene like a tidal wave. Elena would call the police, would tell them about finding her standing over Dominic with a weapon. Even if she tried to explain about the serial killings, about the evidence in the garage, it would sound like the desperate story of a woman caught in the act of attempted murder. "They will arrest you for trying to kill me," Dominic continued, his smile growing wider. "And I will be the poor victim, the loving son who nearly died at the hands of his mentally unstable mother. Do you think they will believe your story about me being a serial killer? Or will they think you are just a disturbed woman who snapped under pressure?" She could already see how it would play out. Dominic would play the victim perfectly, would garner sympathy and support while she was painted as a delusional mother who'd tried to murder her own child. The evidence in the garage would disappear before the police thought to look for it, and Elena Hartwell would still die. Maybe not tonight, but soon, once the heat died down and Dominic was free to resume his activities. "Unless," he said, struggling to sit up straighter, "you finish what you started right now. Kill me before they get here, and at least Elena lives. You will go to prison for murder, probably spend the rest of your life behind bars, but you will have saved one innocent life." It was a choice between impossible options: let him live and watch him destroy more lives while she rotted in prison for attempted murder, or kill him now and accept the consequences of becoming a murderer herself. The sound of sirens in the distance made the decision for her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, raising the knife again. "No," Dominic said, his voice suddenly clear and sharp. "You are not sorry. You are doing what needs to be done. You are being strong." The knife came down with all the force of a mother's love and a mother's rage, and a mother's terrible understanding that sometimes the only way to save the world from your child is to destroy the child yourself. The sirens were getting closer, but Darlene barely heard them. She sat on the kitchen floor, cradling Dominic's head in her lap as his blood soaked into her apron, and for the first time in months, she felt peace. When Detective Reynolds burst through the door 3 minutes later, he found her sitting exactly where Elena had described, a mother holding her dead son, covered in blood, with a knife lying on the floor beside them. "Mrs. Kowalski," he approached slowly, his weapon drawn but not pointed at her. "Are you injured?" "No," she said without looking up. "But you need to search the garage. You need to find his journals, his photographs. You need to know what he was. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the body and put your hands where I can see them." Elena Hartwell, she continued as if he hadn't spoken. 17 years old, works at Brennan's Bakery. He was going to kill her tonight at 6:15 in Riverside Park. You need to make sure she's safe. Other officers were arriving now, securing the scene, calling for paramedics who would find nothing to do but confirm what was already obvious. Darlene let them cuff her hands behind her back, let them read her rights, let them load her into the back of a patrol car. As they drove away from 2127 Maple Grove Avenue, she caught a glimpse of Elena Hartwell standing across the street, with a crowd of neighbors, very much alive and unharmed. The girl's eyes met hers through the car window, and for just a moment, Darlene thought she saw something like understanding in that young face. Understanding, and maybe even gratitude. 6 hours later, after they'd searched the garage and found the photographs and the journals and the carefully organized evidence of multiple murders spanning 3 years, Detective Reynolds came to her cell. 23 victims, he said, sitting down across from her in the interview room. 23 that we can confirm so far. There might be more. I know, You saved Elena Hartwell's life. I know that too. The district attorney is willing to discuss a plea arrangement. Manslaughter instead of murder 1, with your cooperation and the extenuating circumstances. He shrugged. You might be out in 10 years. 15 at most. Darlene nodded, though the specifics didn't really matter to her. Elena Hartwell was alive. The killing had stopped. Everything else was just details. Why didn't you call us? Detective Reynolds asked. When you first suspected, when you found the evidence, why didn't you come to the police? It was a fair question, and one she'd been asking herself since the moment she'd plunged the knife into her son's chest. Because he was my son, she said simply, and I hoped, that maybe I could save him somehow, find a way to get him help, to fix whatever was broken inside him. But you couldn't. No. Some things can't be fixed. Some people can't be saved. She looked up at the detective, her eyes dry and calm. But other people can. Elena Hartwell went home to her family tonight because I finally accepted that truth. Detective Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The families of the victims want to thank you. They want you to know that you gave them justice and closure, and the knowledge that he will never hurt anyone else. That's enough, Darlene said. That's all I wanted. As they led her back to her cell, she thought about Elena Hartwell walking home safely through Riverside Park, about Rebecca Martinez's mother finally getting answers, about all the future victims who would never become victims because she'd found the strength to do what needed to be done. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because sometimes being a mother means protecting everyone else's children from your own. Epilogue. Des Moines Register. Local woman confesses to killing serial killer son. Darlene Kowalski, 52 of Maple Grove Avenue, has confessed to the murder of her son Dominic, 19, who police now believe was responsible for the deaths of at least 23 people across Iowa and neighboring states over the past 3 years. She saved my life, said Elena Hartwell, 17, who police believe was intended to be the killer's next victim. I don't understand how a mother could do that to her own child, but I'm alive because she did. Mrs. Kowalski is expected to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter charges in exchange for her cooperation with the ongoing investigation into her son's crimes. The story would be told and retold in the years that followed, in true crime books and television documentaries and whispered conversations over dinner tables across America. But for those who lived it, for those who survived it, the only thing that mattered was that the killing had stopped. And sometimes that has to be enough.